He's talking about hamstring stretching and power. Does static hamstring stretching reduce its power? And working in rugby, he says it's not encouraged before a match anymore.
Yeah, there's been some hiccups over the years where people have gone heavily into their stretching before a match or before a sprint or something like that, and they just have a terrible performance. And that's partly because you're inhibiting. It's quite well documented now that you inhibit the neural drives to a tissue when you stretch. Now, if you've got a facilitated tissue, if your hamstrings are facilitated and you've got a posterior pelvic tilt, then it may not be a bad thing to stretch them a little bit before you train, possibly before you compete. But you wouldn't want to do that on everyone. You want that to be quite specific to the individual. You want to know whether or not those muscles seem to be facilitated. So there are ways to test for that.
I'd looked into stretching for hamstrings at the time because I wasn't really happy with this whole idea of static stretching of any sort.
Yeah.
And I ended up trying to get them to do some ballistic stretches, which of course means flexing the hip and then extending the knee and doing that in a sort of a signal. And that was supposed to be more beneficial. But I do wonder actually whether it's actually just more of a warm-up exercise for the muscles rather than a stretch for the hamstrings.
Yeah, well, this is one of the issues with static stretches is that what it does is it sedates the nervous system, but also the cerebellum is constantly registering the length-tension relationships in the muscles. And when you're static and sedating the nervous system, then it doesn't really re-register the new length-tension relationship. But when you're dynamic, like with a ballistic stretch, or if you use a balance device like a Swiss ball or a Bosu or one of these things that requires more balance to actually stay from falling over, then what that does is it switches on the cerebellum more effectively. Also, contract relax techniques, because you're contracting the muscle, the cerebellum straight away going, what's going on here? And then you stretch, and the cerebellum's taking account of the new length-tension relationship. So then you're far less likely to get injured. So we generally, again, in the check system, we would generally recommend contract relax type stretching if you're going to use any stretching at all before competition, because you're more likely for the brain to know the new positions of the muscles effectively.